everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I got a question from a viewer recently asking me whether or not I use the float and fly. And if you're a fan of the channel, you probably have seen in the past that I've done videos on float and flies. It truly is one of the best wintertime baits that you can throw. In fact, I would go as far as saying it's maybe one of the most underutilized baits for fishing year round. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of different ways to approach the float and fly technique. Basically, the standard is to use a, slip bobber like this. You put a bobber stop or a knot of some sort to allow your bobber to stop at a certain depth, but it's really just utilizing a bobber to fish a certain type of hair jig. That's the standard. Most people would say that your fly is going to be a hair jig. But what I'm here to tell you is there's a bunch of different things you can do with your bobber to create a float and fly effect. And that's what we're going to get into today. I want to talk about some different baits. I want to talk about some different uh, areas to fish them, just different approaches, because it has become more of a forgotten lure, in my opinion. It's not even a lure, it's more of a setup, a technique. There are a few areas in the country, I feel like still over in like Tennessee and Kentucky, people are using the float and fly technique quite a bit, but it's not being used in most other areas in the country. And I can tell you it works everywhere. It really comes down to the presentation. Up here in the North Country, I've used it to crush wintering fish, but I've also used it to catch a lot of summertime fish. And that's what we'll get into. Before I share these tips with you, I want to remind you that if you're looking to support the channel, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link, which I put in the video description. It's a great way to support the channel. Every dollar I make from that comes right back to supporting the YouTube channel. So for those of you that are using that, thank you very much. And don't forget, you can bookmark that link so that you have it for future purchases. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the float and fly. Like I said, a standard setup is a slip bobber that you have a bobber stop or a knot, whatever it is that's your preference. Generally speaking, for me, I prefer to go with a bobber stop if I'm going to be fishing in 10 foot of water or less. If I go deeper than 10 foot, the bobber stop becomes hard to use because you almost have to bring it into your guides and your rod to cast. So from that standpoint, I'll switch over to a knot that generally works just fine. But that's the only thing I don't like about a float and fly. If you want to fish deeper water, you got to figure out a way to come up with a knot or something that goes through your guides that you can cast because you need it to stop on your slip bobber. Uh, so a couple of things with the setup of it. So like I said, you've got your bobber stop, you've got your bobber. Uh, I also like to go with a much longer rod for the reason I just pointed out. I generally use a 7.5 to an 8 foot medium light action spinning rod. I want the long length to allow me to cast this further because a lot of times you're talking about baits that are not extremely heavy. And at the same time, I want something to allow me to get a bobber stop or a knot further away from my reel to allow me to fish this in deeper water and still be able to make accurate casts. Uh, from a from a line perspective, generally I'm going to be fishing straight 6 to 8 pound fluorocarbon line. Now this is a very good finesse tactic. So from that standpoint, the lighter the line, generally you're gonna generate more strikes from that. So I like to go with 6 is my standard. If the water's a little off colored, I might go with 8. If it's extremely clear, I might drop down to 4 pound test. Now, from a location standpoint, this is one of the keys to being a successful float and fly fisherman. Generally speaking, I like to fish. You need to be fishing targets. So I like to be fishing areas where you know the fish are holding to them. And this is one of the reasons why this is such a good winter technique. You know, when you're talking about wintering fish, you're talking about like your bluff walls, maybe standing timber, maybe a channel swing bank, maybe an isolated big boulder. You want to be putting your float and fly in the area where the fish are holding. It's not a great bait for covering water on flats just because the fish could be anywhere. So when you have a very specific target that you want to fish, the float and fly is great because you can throw it over there and suspend your bait right above those fish. Now, having said that, if I'm fishing maybe more in the North Country where we don't have as many bluff walls or we don't have channel swing banks or you know, a lot of standing timber, I do fish these very successfully over deep humps and on break lines and on points. If I know that there are smallmouth or largemouth that are using those areas to winter, that's where I'm going to be looking to suspend this bait. In fact, you can do it vertically a lot of times. So if I'm fishing down in 25 or 30 foot of water, I can basically get right over the top of the fish, drop my bobber down, and let my bobber do the work for me. Because one of the keys to the presentation of a float and fly, in my opinion, is to impart very little action. The more action, generally, I feel like I get less bites. So I'm going to be looking to present this in a manner where I cast it out, let my bait slowly go down to the depth where it sits, you know, at with the bobber. And at that point, I don't do anything. You may have a little bit of action that's imparted by your wave action and ripples that are on the water. But generally speaking, I'm not doing much. I may twitch it a few times and keep it in place, but I'm just imparting very little action. And if I'm fishing it, what I may do is make a long cast, say if I'm on a bluff wall and I'm fishing it more from a going down, making horizontal casts along the bluff wall, I may cast it longer, let it sit for 30 seconds, sometimes up to a minute in a spot, and then I'll reel it in 15 or 20 feet and let my bait fall back down so I can become much more efficient at covering water with a float and fly in that instance. But generally speaking, I'm letting this sit right over the cover. If I've got a big boulder and I know there's fish hanging around that boulder, and it's at 12 feet, I'll set my bobber a foot, maybe 2 feet off the bottom, and I'll put it right on top of them. If I'm fishing a bluff wall and I think the fish are sitting in 10 foot of water, over 30 feet of water along the bluff, I'll set it at 8, 9, 10 foot of water, somewhere in that range. Because generally speaking, they're not going to come that far to eat it, especially in the winter months. So that's kind of what I'm looking for from a setup standpoint. The locations are really going to come down to knowing where those fish are at and fishing targets versus trying to fish big stretches of area because a float and fly is just not super productive in doing that. Now, from a bait perspective, like I said, most people are used to seeing hair jigs of some form. Now, this one's curled up a little bit because I had it in my box, but this is just a straight bucktail hair jig. I've got a little flashaboo in there. Now, this is one that I've tied. I generally tie my own hair jigs. I've got another one here. And I'll tie them longer, but I'll trim them down a lot of times. But I tie them longer because that way I can use them in a lot of different situations, not just a float and fly. But if I were fishing as a float and fly, I generally cut them down so that, you know, they'd probably be, I'm going to say about that long. A lot of different materials you can use, but you don't have to tie them yourself. You can buy a lot of ones out there. Punisher Lures is, I think, one of the more famous float and fly ones. I think they go by Dale Hollow Tackle or Dale Hollow Lures now, but I think they're the same as Punisher. I'll put a link for that up in the video. But it doesn't have to be just hair. I mean, you can get ones with feathers tied in. I still like to use a black marabou jig or a white marabou jig. So that's your traditional fly approach. But I'm here to tell you guys that's where I think a lot of people are missing out. One of my most productive baits on the float and fly technique is to go with a 90-degree jig head like my guppy head with a small minnow bait. This is just a Zoom tiny fluke. The Demiki armor shad is a great one. The whole idea being that it's basically you're fishing the Demiki rig, which is a vertical presentation where you're holding it down there. You're fishing the Demiki rig further away from the boat, meaning if you know there's a bluff wall or a nice cedar tree along a bluff wall, you can cast the Demiki rig out using your float and fly and keep it suspended in the same area and fish it the same way you would fish a Demiki rig right under the boat. So this has become a big favorite of mine of fishing a small plastic bait on it. The next one that I truly love to fish is a weightless 4-inch Berkeley Max Scent the General. I'll fish it in a wacky rig style, so I'll just take a small finesse wide gap hook, rig it like that, and I'll let this just slowly sink down. Now, when I said before in the video that a float and fly rig presentation is not just for wintering fish. This is one of the ones I'm talking about. Now, this is something that I started doing years ago for fishing docks with a bobber with my little boys. I would take a slip bobber, I would set it at 3 feet. If I was fishing a dock that maybe was in 4 or 5 feet, I would cast it out, I would give them the rod, and then this would slowly sink down under the bobber. And I can't tell you how many times the boys caught nice largemouth fishing summertime areas around docks and stumps and laydowns, just giving a wacky rig a presentation that was a little bit easier and allowed them to watch it. And you'd be amazed that letting this bait just suspend and barely move around is a key to generating a lot of strikes with a wacky rig. So don't think that with your float and flies, you have to be throwing a straight traditional fly. Yes, it works, but it's not necessarily a must. You can fish some of the newer, smaller minnow style plastics. The key I would tell you though, with any of your choices, is you want to go with that 90-degree jig head. You know, whether it's the flies that you might tie or a plastic like the guppy head, what that 90-degree jig head does is it keeps your bait in a horizontal position. If this was a 60 or a 30, it would start rotating like that and sit like that in the water. You want it to sit as horizontal as possible, and that's a big, big part of having a successful float and fly approach. The other tip I'll give you with this, and this is something a lot of the old timer float and fly fishermen will tell you, is you are better off applying scent to these as well. A lot of ones out there that you can use, but one of the keys is just to apply a little bit of scent to it. Whether it's some that are a little bit more sticky, like you've got your there's various all there's all kinds of various kinds, and again I'll link some to it. But the key here is this bait is sitting there just letting fish come to you. So if you've got a little bit of scent, whether that's a spray on like a Berkeley Gulp or whether that's a rub on one, it really doesn't matter. The key here is that is a little bit of scent dispersion that gives the fish a little bit of a better look at your bait. It gives them the reason to bite it. You know, generally speaking, I think it's one of the best times to use scent. Anytime you've got a bait that's not moving and those fish can just look at, a little bit of scent will help you in those circumstances more than hurt you, in my opinion. You got your fast moving baits, the scent's not as important. But when you have a bait that is just suspending there, that's going to be a big thing. The one I was trying to think of was the smelly jellies. That's one I like to rub on with my hand. They've got a little bit of glitter mixed in, and it just disperses in the water. But the point here is float and flies are great. There's a lot of things you can do with it. You can adapt it more towards our current time. So by fishing a few different baits on it, applying some sense to it and doing some different things. But don't overlook them. It has become a forgotten technique that generates strikes big time in the winter months, but it works all year long and you can apply it to so many different techniques and areas. That's just something that I feel like it's worth exploring with. So hopefully this answers the viewer question. It truly is a technique I love to fish. One of the other great things about it in the winter months, it's an easy presentation and it's one that doesn't require a ton of effort, meaning a lot of it is bobber watching. So if you've got big gloves on your hand and your fingers are numb, it's a good, easy, simple presentation to do that generates strikes better than most other techniques. So hopefully this was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new tip video coming out tomorrow.